Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Multicultural Media Correspondents Association series on the media's role in engendering trust and giving voice to marginalized communities. I'm Lucido Canto. I'm the Executive Vice President and Managing Director at BCW Global. I've been thinking this day as our nation celebrates the life and legacy of our dear friend, Congressman John Lewis, and his heroism in the fight for equality, human rights, and racial justice, about the lessons that he taught us during his lifetime. He said, you must find a way to get in the way. You must find a way to get into trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. These are essentially the words that he also said to me in what would be the very last conversation that we would ever have during an event last year that MMCA hosted with the Congressional Black Caucus on media diversity. He said to me, Lisi, our struggle is not over. You must keep fighting for justice. I was thinking about that conversation with Congressman Lewis, as I reflected that half a century ago, members of the Kerner Commission, an advisory board formed by the President Lyndon Johnson in response to a series of race riots, spelled out the role of a mostly white media in failing to cover the cause of unrest during that time. It called on news outlets across the country to diversify. In the decades since, including diverse perspectives in the media and elsewhere, has become broadly accepted. Yet 50 years after Kerner, we still see chronic underrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities in print and broadcast media. What happens when the demographics of the media look nothing like the demographics of the communities they cover? It means that the people who are most likely to appear in stories are the least likely to have a say in how those stories are told. This is what MMCA fights for every day, to give voice to a marginalized community and to move the needle on diverse media. I want to invite you now to watch a brief video on MMCA and its impact.
We see a media diversity crisis with serious economic, social, and political implications. 40% of the population have no ownership in an industry that represents 20% of the economy. Media bias and stereotyping is fanning the fire of hatred and division. Dying local news outlets are crippling civic engagement. And worst of all, not seeing positive stories about their community is stifling the dreams and aspirations of Black and brown children across this nation.
We hosted the inaugural Multicultural Media Correspondents Dinner to ignite a call to action to move the needle on media diversity.
We don't just tell colored stories. We tell stories in color.
During the dinner, we honored multicultural media luminaries who all shared their struggles and highlighted the need for increased media diversity.
Not enough to shore. It takes money, it takes capital.
It has to be multicultural. It has to be people coming together.
There's no way to create that cultural change without the authentic voices.
Stories of multicultural people have tremendous value.
In order to harness and sustain the energy and power of the MMCD, we formed the Multicultural Media Correspondents Association, and it quickly became a powerful platform. MMCA serves as a trusted bridge and convener, enabling difficult, solutions-focused conversations in a common ground environment. It serves as a vehicle to provide thought leadership. It effectively influences and communicates policy developments.
You have to just go at it as if you have the same rights that everyone else has to do what you need to do to fulfill your dream.
And it provides information and resources for both individuals and stakeholder organizations. Most notably, MMCA has worked with Representative Demings to introduce resolutions that reaffirms Congress's support for media diversity. We ask that journalists and media professionals join our community and become diversity champions, and that media companies and stakeholder groups become strategic partners by providing funding and support. Together, we can move the needle on media diversity. Thank you.
I want to thank the MMCA Board of Directors for their tireless efforts in this fight. I want to thank also Verizon Media and Yahoo for their support of MMCA in this series. I also want to thank our distinguished panel today, including our unsung hero, Elinor Ruth Tatum, publisher and editor of the New York Amsterdam News. And now I have the great privilege of introducing our moderator tonight, my friend and brother, Jamel Simmons. Jamel has spent most of his career at the nexus of politics and media. He's currently a political contributor to CBS News. And until early 2020, Jamel produced and hosted a series of several segments for Hill TV, where he interviewed presidential candidates, congressional leaders, celebrities, and activists. He is no stranger to TV and presidential candidates, having been a regular presence on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and also having helped elect President Bill Clinton and President Barack Obama to the presidency. He has a long and distinguished career, and I encourage you to read his bio, his full bio in the text. And Jamel, I'm so glad to have you here together with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That'll make great bedtime reading for anybody with children. Put them right to sleep. I want to thank you, Lacey, for having me be a part of this, and you and David Morgan. This is a fantastic organization. It's something that I'm going to be very brief, because it's something that I think is very needed. I have been on this side of the business, either in front of the camera or as an entrepreneur trying to start a media tech entity, and it is difficult whichever way you try to do it. So everybody doing it, I applaud you for your effort. I'm going to invite and I'm going to introduce David Morgan, who leads this organization. David, I've known probably almost as long as I've been a professional in Washington, D.C. He has been an executive with major corporations. He has been on Capitol Hill, and he now is running this organization. David, thank you for leading this and for having me too.
Jamel, thank you, my brother. I appreciate you and all you do, and thank you so much for being a part of this. Lacey, I also want to thank you for all that you do, as well as the entire MMCA board, for holding me down, and on days like today, lifting me up. I really appreciate your comments about Mr. Lewis. And, right now, I think on behalf of the members, our partners, I'd like to take a moment of privilege to pay tribute to Mr. Lewis, who's been a friend of MMCA, and actually would love to share a video from the event you referenced last year.
Next to my colleague, a legend and an icon, and who has far more seniority on the Hill than I do, the Honorable John Lewis.
Thank you very much, my beautiful, charming sister from Brooklyn. Thank you. You look good tonight. No, you look colorful too. David, thank you so much for having us, and MMCA, for all that you do to tell the necessary story. Speak up and get in trouble, okay? Thank you very much, and thank you for this weekend.
Please join me in a brief moment of silence for a great civil rights icon and Congressman, the Honorable John Lewis. Thank you. We are so proud to be able to call Mr. Lewis a friend and supporter. And as you can see in the video, with Ms. Clarke there, we are just thrilled by the level of congressional support for the work we do. It really fuels us because we know without those champions, we would not be able to have the success we're having. So I thank them, and I look forward to working with Representative Clarke and the other members of her Multicultural Media Caucus to continue to fight and to continue Mr. Lewis's legacy in our work. Jamal, back to you, my friend.
Thanks, David. I want to take the privilege now to introduce Katharine Zaleski. Katharine is the co-founder and president of PowerToFly. She is an entrepreneur, and she is somebody very focused on inclusion, diversity, and frankly, she's one of the most connected movers and shakers you're ever going to want to meet. So, Katharine, thank you for being here.
You're making me feel good. I haven't really been out of the house in 5 months, so it's good to know that people think I can move and shake still. So that's awesome. So proud to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
All right. So next, we are going to have the rest of the folks who are joining us. Mindy Marqués González. There she is up on the screen. She's the publisher and executive editor of the Miami Herald Media Company. She's also McClatchy News' Florida regional editor and the first Latina, I think, first Hispanic woman to be an editor at the Miami Herald. Thank you for joining us, Mindy.
Thank you so much for having me as part of this important discussion.
Okay. So thank you all. Are we at a moment? I just want to ask this to get us started, and you guys, I want you to leap in with some comments about how you want to address this. But are we at a moment with so much stress taking place in the American society, whether it's the COVID coronavirus problem that has us all doing this on Zoom and at home instead of being with each other, the unrest that's taking place around police and their assault on African-American men and women that has been gone unpunished for too long. Are we at a moment where major news organizations are going to pick up the mantle of telling these stories well, or are we still at a moment where we need to have news organizations, media companies that are led by people of color to really push the ball forward and tell these stories in a much more compelling way? I'm not going to start with you, David, because I know the answer to your question, because that's the reason why we're here. But I'm going to start with you, Mindy, because you're sitting inside of one of these organizations.
So, I think the responsibility falls across all media, right? And I think that I sit in a really interesting place at the Miami Herald. We have a sister publication on Nuevo Herald, which is a Spanish language daily. And the reality is that it is our responsibility to cover the communities and to reflect the communities that we're in. You would consider us perhaps a mainstream media as the Miami Herald. Miami, of course, is probably 20 years ahead of the rest of the country in terms of the demographic changes that have really shaped this community. And we've had to react to that. And I think the fact that I'm sitting here today as the editor of the Miami Herald is a testament to someone having the foresight, right, 30 years ago, to hire me, right, right out of college and give me a chance. And I really believe that it is absolutely, it's not just a moral imperative, it is absolutely makes business sense for your newsroom to reflect your community. You cannot really accurately tell the stories of your community if you don't have people who understand the nuance of the cultures, of the of the ethnicities, of the the language even. And so it's just long overdue, quite frankly. It's we can no longer operate with what I call the foreign correspondent syndrome, where somebody pops into your community and treats it like some exotic locale, and then they pop out, right? They miss the stories. They miss the real stories.
Mindy, let's go to you on this question, and you tell me, as you deal with this from a gender lens, an identity lens, obviously ethnic lens, how do we get these mainstream organizations to pay attention? Or is it still going to be incumbent upon people who come from those genders and identities and ethnicities to tell their own stories?
I think that I think it's both. It's both, right? The answer is both. But sitting from where I sit in a mainstream media one would call, right? Look, we have to start by hiring people. You got to start by hiring the people who can reflect the community. That is the only way that you really turn the corner, right? So you have to be committed to that. And I think that means that you have to say sometimes, I'm not going to make a hire unless you bring me a pool of diverse candidates, and I'm going to pick from qualified, excellent, qualified candidates who are diverse. That's what, I think you just have to draw the line in the sand and say, I'm committed to this type of hiring and do it, right?
Okay, that one was on me because I actually went to go to Katharine on that question. But that was a good answer, Mindy. I liked it. Katharine, can you pick that up?
Yeah, no, she gave a great answer, and it's like a perfect lead-in for me. So I was the sixth employee at Huffington Post. I was the executive producer of digital at the Washington Post when I was 28, and nobody believed that digital had a future. That was in 2009, and then went on to start Now This, and then after that, went on to start my own company, PowerToFly, specifically for the reason that Mindy just raised. Like, I was in charge of a lot of hiring at places like the Washington Post and Huffington Post, and realized that if I was going to do it through my network, it was going to be predominantly white, and it was going to be a group of people who really didn't have the experiences of the world that we needed to report on accurately, and you're doing a huge disservice. And so, in order to change that, we needed to invest in a real technology product that would go out there and find people in different communities by building data sets and inviting people to come in for interviews, inviting people who are not in the networks that you see within newsrooms, and really making sure that you're going out and telling those people that they could belong within those newsrooms, because you just don't get that through the referral networks that have built up so many news organizations. And it's at the end of the day, it's really it's a resources, numbers. You got to build the top of the pipeline, and that takes a lot of work.
So David, this is a great place to bring you in here because thank you, Katharine. It's a great place to bring you in here because really what you're doing is building one of those networks. And I think a lot of people have already seen the value of it. Can you talk to us about what you see as the future of having this kind of participation and where the participation sits, whether it's in an owned entity or a bigger, mainstream entity?
It's a great question because I reflect on it and I look at it. There was always sort of whether you look from a glass full or glass empty, right? So let me just sort of give the bad news. The bad news when, Lisa mentioned 50 years ago when the Kerner Commission implicated the media and its role in the social exchange, there was a lot of effort, a lot of energy that went into diversifying the media. We saw over the years a lot of media companies, broadcast companies popped up, some great organizations like NABJ, NHJ, and we saw some great sort of legislation on Capitol Hill, like the broadcast tax certificate that was increasing ownership. And then we fast forward today, and a lot of those gains have been erased. A lot of the organization in the fight are just not getting the level of recognition that they need. They're not sort of getting the level of support. And so I think it's hard to put it in a context of an organization. It has to take a step back and put into a larger conversation of how do we make this a national priority issue? How do we get the average person to understand the importance of reflecting on the fact that who owns the story controls so much. They control the narrative, which are going to control public attitudes, which is going to control public action. And it's actually going to, if left in the hands of one or group, sort of enshrine power and undergird unjust social systems. So I think every organization should be in the fight. And I just like to broaden sort of the responsibility and the effort that we should all get together as a coalition. So I thank you for acknowledging that MMCA in our approach is not to go this alone, because we know we're resolved, but we know fully well we can't do this alone. So we try to strategically align with other organizations, other entities, other allies to see if we can collectively move the ball forward.
You know, one thing that's been incredibly clear over the last few years to me is that people of color, well, first of all, every generation, basically after, I think we're mostly all Generation Xers here. The two generations after us are so much more diverse, right? 43% of millennials, 50% plus of the generation after them. So the American story is going to be a diverse story. I mean, it already is, but it's going to be a majority diverse story, people of color story. So it seems like as a business idea, it just makes sense to situate yourself where the market is going to be, not just today, but going forward. And when you look at television, some of the television, you look at some of the movies, the Fast and Furious series is the one that always jumps out to me, because it's like they got a little taste from everybody's community that's in that, you know, in that movie franchise, and they make more money than anybody. So Mindy, what is it that's holding some of the organizations, not in a place like Miami, what's holding them back from seeing the kind of diversity that maybe we want to, or maybe they're doing it and we just don't notice?
You know, I think that sometimes, the business imperative may not be there. And like I said, you know, I think the United States is changing and more quickly, right? Reflecting a diversity that, like I said, we've seen for over 2 decades now, right? Or 3 decades. And so it behooved us to adjust, because our very survival depended on it, right? I mean, we launched El Nuevo Herald, which is a Spanish language daily product, about 20 years after the first wave of Cubans came to Miami. And at the time, I think a lot of us said, wow, we're late to this party. And now, you know, it seems prescient to say, oh, we had that. And now, and it wasn't just Cubans, but, you know, Colombians and Nicaraguans and Venezuelans. And so we've had a product to serve like the first generation Spanish dependent immigrants. And I think that it was, we had to pivot to serve a need. And I think that's what other media is going to have to do. Like you said, you know, at the end of the day, I think the financial imperative is going to really drive. And I think there's a moral imperative, and we all know that that's really the key. But if nothing else, the business model is going to drive the need to really be more reflective of the communities we serve and of this country.
So let's talk about that. And I think we're going to be joined by Lisi DeCanto in a second. Let's talk about that, Katharine, because you're building, you're raising money, you're holding events. I mean, there are only 2 or 3 different business models that seem to work in media. And advertising seems to be an increasingly less productive place to put your business in the hands of. So how do you build a media company in an environment like the one we're in today?
Well, that's a great question. I came in at the end of the media, the great media period in 2005 with Huffington Post, and you know, I think many people sort of blame Huffington Post for helping destroy the old model. So I'm a bit of, I guess, a villain in the situation as well. But I would say, you know, what's really interesting in being out here in San Francisco right now and seeing how people think about business right now, there's talk around sort of verticalized communities. And verticalized communities means, for lack of a better word, you know, communities of women, communities of people of color, and very specifically connecting with those different communities on behalf of certain businesses who want to have more diversity in their companies, for example, and being able to engage with those communities. And I think media has a lot of potential to sort of take the old classified business and try to apply that to the verticalized community business when it comes to job searching. You know, you think about, there's a phrase that's starting to bubble up around here, which sounds rather obnoxious because so many people are out of work, but you're starting to hear venture capitalists talk about the great rehiring. You know, like we're so far off from that right now, but people are trying to build businesses around the great rehiring right now. And with the focus being on building more diverse and inclusive teams, because to Mindy's point, they actually build better, stronger, more profitable businesses. You can look at studies from McKinsey, you can look at studies from Ernst & Young and Deloitte that literally show surveys across Fortune 500s and across the S&P Global where results are higher. Companies are trying. That's why they want more diverse candidates right now. So I think actually media can focus on more niche communities and try to sort of funnel them into jobs. That's one idea right there.
All right, so
I have a lot of other ideas.
I'm not going to let you off the hook since you are out there in the valley, which I think is part of the source of the problem that we're facing.
Yeah. Well, I'm in San Francisco right now, but yes.
Okay,
so I'm walking away.
Well,
yeah.
in Northern California, for those of us who are outside of it.
I live in Brooklyn. Just want to say that.
So if we've got, so the reason I don't want to let you off the hook is because I question whether or not the people who are making these financial decisions actually really understand the cases that are being made. If you've got 4% of the venture capital industry, which are people of color, or Black or Latino, and you've got a situation where particularly Black and Latino women are the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs. They create $44 billion in revenue, yet Black women can get 0.2% of the venture capital money that's being spent in the country. You raise about $36,000 versus another company that could raise $1.3 million. The evidence would say that making money and building a product is not really the only question in terms of getting funding.
Oh yeah, no, I mean it's terrible.
So how do we actually build these vertically integrated businesses, whether they're women, Latino, African American, LGBTQ? Like, how do we build these vertical businesses if the people making the financing decisions don't really understand the communities that will be coming to pitch to get money?
Yeah, well, one of the ways to do it is to not let venture capital get all the rewards and to take these ideas and put them into established businesses like at the Miami Herald. I'm not gonna say the Washington Post because that's owned by Bezos now, but all these businesses, like take a playbook from out here where they're building out new business models, put them into these more traditional businesses that can actually build the kind of communities that people out here can't build because it's been so, frankly, just hard. That's a very light word. It's been terrible for anybody to raise money out here for the reasons you just stated and try to flip the system on its head. So and that maybe some of the funding can go within established organizations.
Okay, Dave, I'm coming to you, but let's bring in Lisi DeCanto. Is Lisi going to join our conversation? There he is. All right, so Lisi's here with us. Dave, as you're out, because you're even raising money for MMCA, what's your take on this question? I mean, you've been an executive at a financial company. Like, what's your take on this question about actually getting people of color funded to build these companies?
Yeah, no, I think, it's a very interesting problem. And I think it has to be a little of change in inertia and changing some entrenched attitudes and biases that sometimes, as you highlighted and Katharine highlighted, it really doesn't make sense from an investor perspective why some of these really good deals are not happening. So I think our view is that it's really going to take what are the levers that can be put to put pressure, not just to have good conversation, great statements, but how do you translate that into like effective action where it's clear that it's going to stay towards the business model and the bottom line and making sure the ROIs are still in place. So we think, one of the things, this is an area for groups like the U.S. Chamber, and, we're excited to see that the Chamber has taken on this effort and is, making the case that, greater diversity and investment should happen. I think there's an area for lawmaking. If you remember, the broadcast tax certificate was one instrument that the government sort of introduced that helped flow some capital into the area. And people might remember the SSBICs and the small business investment companies. So I think you're going to need a combination of sort of internal inertia, getting the executives and the venture capital community to change attitudes, but you're probably going to need some external pressure coming from the public, coming from the government, as well as some incentives to really move the needle.
So Lisi, this is a great place to bring you in. You've been somebody who's been petitioning Congress on behalf of clients for a long time. There's in the Comcast deal, right? When Comcast Universal was created, they did a lot of media creation in that point in terms of, we saw Sean Puffy Combs get a channel, get Revolt. I mean, we saw Magic Johnson got Aspire TV, was sort of born in that moment. Do we think that there's any push that could be made at the FCC, at the FTC, to get them to Justice Department, to get them to try to get these companies to do something that will be productive for building new media companies?
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, well, look what happened with the Oscars. There was an intense push and it became more diversified, and we've seen what the effect of that has been. But I think there is an opportunity for public and private, as Dave and Katharine has mentioned, to make sure that the investments are there, and the incentivization that the public sector can play here is enormous. Look, my old boss and friend, Barney Frank, once told me that money isn't the answer to everything, but without it, not much can happen. And this is an example of not much can happen unless there's investment coming in, investment that comes in that's reflective of the very needs of the communities. I said early on in my opening comment that if the media isn't reflective and as diverse of the diversity that exists and those that they covered, then the voices of people that look like us here on this in our talk today get lost, and get redefined in ways that I think don't contribute to bringing us together, but contribute to the divide that separates us. We've seen the stories and the ways in which they've been told throughout these twin crises that have convulsed our country, both with systemic racism and then COVID. That's just one example of how it has a real impact. And investment here is going to be a key part, both from the public and private sector.
Mindy, I want to change lanes and come back to you on something. So when you have diverse voices, diverse faces, ethnicities, genders, identities who are involved in covering stories, one of the questions that's come up recently is the line between someone's personal belief and statement, a tweet, a statement in a social media post, and they're covering a story. Where is the line for a person of color, particularly, let's just take this question of systemic racism, right? Where is the line between advocacy and straight news coverage, whether in your personal life and in your professional life? How do you guys draw that line to keep people from being accused of being quote unquote fake news or whatever else it is you may get attacked for?
Yeah, I'll tell you, that's an increasingly complex question as we have younger and younger reporters. I mean, the more, we've hired a lot of millennials, and I think that there's a push and pull because they have different views than what we traditionally have had in mainstream media about the role. I believe two things. One, I believe that, there are certain statements that can be made that are not political. So saying Black Lives Matter, it's not political, right? Okay. It's just a fact. It's a human rights issue. It's a statement. And so I have no issues, and we've told our staff, we have no issues with you putting that on social media. That's just, it's like, you can't really, there's certain things you can't really be against, right? Right. I think the issue is more complicated because there are some of our staff members who would like to be actively involved, in marching, for instance, or in protest. And my response to that is that, we have a responsibility, but we also have an incredible megaphone in our industry, right? And so we have so much power to amplify voices and to really be able to impact change through the work that we do. And so you don't want to, I think that's not a thing you want to give up. And you give that up if you, become part of the story. So it is a choice. But to me, I think there are folks who they feel very frustrated that they can't get things done. And so they are protesting, they are marching. There's nothing they can do. We have a very, very powerful tool in our hands, right? Through our words, videos, etc. And I think that's the way that we have to, and I think that's the way that we have to wield that tool. And what we can bring through diverse lenses is stories that might not surface. Again, with the nuance that is often missing in the telling of those stories when they're left to folks who lack that perspective.
So, Katharine, when I have been thinking about this, I've seen some of the stories about this. I think about sort of the difference between things that are settled law and things that we're sort of arguing over whether or not they should exist, right? So if you say, I'm against racism, I'm against sexism, I'm against homophobia, that seems to be the kind of thing in our society that is, we all generally agree with that. We a little more, some people are a little darker blue, some people are a little lighter, or a little darker purple, a little lighter. But so the question is, but if you're saying something like, I don't know, like talking about choice, let's say, right? Like that's something that still as a society, we're still wrestling over kind of how we regulate and deal with that issue. So it just feels like it's a policy question that where people are partisans, and if you're going to cover a partisan, not just politically partisan, but they're fighters. If you're going to cover something people are so fighting over, being an advocate in that fight might lessen your ability to be seen as objective. Is that right or wrong? Katharine?
I think that's right. I think that's right. I think what Mindy's saying about journalism being basically the fifth estate and being incredibly powerful in terms of galvanizing people and bringing people together does get diluted if you are part of an argument or policy debate, which can be very nuanced for a lot of people. And social media is what did Jeff Bezos say? It's the de-nuanced destruction machine. I don't know if I fully agree with that, but it is very de-nuanced. And I've seen entire careers be ruined over a de-nuanced, 260 character tweet.
Right.
But then I've seen people ruin their careers over trying to get into nuance when it comes to policy. Or a news story. There's an example of when I was at the Washington Post and oversaw the Twitter, one of the social media people who's actually gone on to a huge career as a White House journalist said there was a kid who had committed suicide. I think it was the Rutgers story. And someone was angry about it on social media. I mean, this was 10 years ago almost. And the response from Washington Post was, well, there's many sides to this story. And someone said, there's not many sides to a kid committing suicide because he's been outed for his sexuality. I mean, there's no two sides for that. So this idea that you can have a balanced debate about everything is just not true, as you say, in many cases. And I think it's pretty clear in most cases, but it's really a hard judgment call within newsrooms. I mean, it's the thing that consistently, I don't envy anybody who's leading that. Sorry, Mindy, but I was there when it was like not that in 2010. It wasn't as I mean, it's just even more intense now.
Absolutely.
It was an issue then.
So David, relatedly, and I want to get to some ideas people have for helping to solve this problem and things we can come up with. But relatedly, we are all holding in our hands these little devices that we all carry around, right? And so the line between who is a journalist is one that is being redefined sort of every day. As you think about this, as somebody who's bringing people together in this space, do you think about responsibilities for new journalists and people who are carrying, who are using these tools to broadcast? Do they have a responsibility? And how does the audience kind of tell the difference? Is that something that your organization really wants to get into?
Oh, absolutely. I think, journalism standards are that. I mean, if, people certainly should be able to have their opinions, but if it's going to be purported to be journalism, there should be some checks and balances and some safeguards. We certainly don't want to stifle, free speech. So it's an area where we rely on the experts. That's why we try very much so in our approach to partner with organizations that are smarter, that are more engaged, and we follow their lead. And our view is that at the end of the day, communities need to have access to trusted, reliable information. And if we can stay true to that principle and mission and have everyone galvanized around that, then I think we can create a playing field where we can bring in these new voices, these influencers who are incredibly powerful and effective, but make sure that their message isn't distorted and they aren't proliferating fake news. And we've seen a lot of that as well. So absolutely.
So Lisa, in your line of work, which used to be my line of work, the beauty of this moment is in the old days, if you lived in Miami, if the Miami Herald editor said no, and the local ABC, NBC, CBS people said no to your story idea, you were done. That was the end of your conversation. And maybe you could get the Miami Times to carry it. But if all those people said no, then you were done. The question now, though, is you still have 100 other places or your own platforms to push stories out. So do you think we're better off with all these new ways to communicate, or do you think it's just complicating it and creating too much noise for anybody to really get anything substantively out?
Well, I think it does both, but I think number one, it democratizes our ability to get the stories out and to share them. As you say, you now have a multiple amount of ways in which to share your story on different platforms, and quite often we have seen that when some of the traditional press may not necessarily publish or move forward with a particular piece, others have, and it's found its way to resonate with a growing number of audience. I think, for example, the work that Medium does is an example of that. And so I think it gives people a voice, the more channels now that exist. At the same time, I think it's, as you said, it's made it very more complicated to try to assess which voices are actually authentic and, to Dave's point, are contributing to the information dialogue and trust, or ones that you're not quite sure. It's made the ability to assess what is true and what's not true all the more complicated. And I think reinforced by all of that is when you start to invoke, as you were saying earlier, partisan views and politics, and then it becomes very complicated. You have to be a student nowadays to be able to discern if what I'm reading in one media channel is accurate, or if I'm reading the same thing from a different standpoint, another one is accurate or not. It forces all of us to have to pay close attention to the sources of the news that we're receiving, and the trust that relationship that we have with media, which is, I think, all the while the more important, that the media is reflective of the very diversity that I think it lacks. You have to be able to see people that look like you, but also be able to have confidence that you're getting the information in a way that is accurate and authentic, and that you can actually use it.
Okay, we do have. Thank you, Lisa. We have one question from the audience here. I'm going to address this to Mindy because you're in the middle of this, waist deep. What do you say to people who say the media shouldn't shape the narrative at all, but should just be objective fact providers?
Well, I mean, here's the deal. That's what we strive to do, right? That's what our goal is. But we're living at a time when people can't even agree on basic facts. And so that complicates our job in a way that really,
True story.
Yeah, because, I'm going to say that, that's blue, and you're going to say, I don't think it's blue, it looks green to me. And so I think that's the difficult, but the truth is, I think it's gotten complicated also because, the nature of the 24 news cycle, and how do you fill the airtime? You fill it with a lot of opinion, analysis, and so we try not to do that, I think, but we do have columnists. I think sometimes readers have issues in distinguishing a piece that's clearly opinion and a columnist, as opposed to a piece that's fact-based, just straightforward journalism. And one interesting thing is I think you find less of an issue on local reporting. It's starting, that whole fake news, when you don't like a fact, is starting to seep into a little bit the local news. But generally, I think studies have shown that people trust their local media way more than they trust national media. And that's because, of course, national media tends to focus on politics, and politics are, as we know, very divided right now in this country. And so, I mean, I've had back and forth with readers who might quibble with a national story, but then if you say to them, do you believe the story about the Heat score? Yeah, the Heat did well. Okay. Do you believe the story that we wrote about, the Miami-Dade County Commission? Yes. Well, we're not selectively this is the thing we're doing throughout all of our coverage, but it gets politicized, and that's where the issues come in.
You know, the one place where I think that's generally right. The one place where I would add is that may be a little different in some communities if you feel like you're marginalized, right? And so if you feel like the broader kind of society isn't paying attention to your issues. I remember I grew up in Detroit, and there was a real feeling that, you know, the Detroit News was owned by Gannett, the Detroit Free Press was owned by Knight Ridder. There was a real feeling that Black politics in the city of Detroit were being covered with a lens that didn't really reflect the conversation that was happening inside the community. It was a lens that was outside the community. At that point, you know, there were a lot of questions about which stories got covered and which ones didn't, even though it was incredibly local and incredibly small.
We had that, you know, to be honest, we faced that issue here early on, right? When you know, you saw a lot of Hispanics, Cubans, you know, get elected, but then we had to do the hard stories that were about, you know, somebody taking, you know, bribes and somebody being investigated. And then, so that's really difficult because you're still a journalist, and regardless, you know, you're going to have to cover those issues, but it is more difficult. I think it was more difficult back then too, because to your point, I don't think the leadership reflected the community. And so that creates an issue of, you know, lack of trust. I think now, you know, we've had to do unflattering stories of the city where I grew up in, you know, and I've had very unflattering things said about me by the mayor of that community. But, you know, we're just trying to do our job.
So David, let's just get to what's your sense about moving forward? How are you trying to get more people of color into organizations and starting their own organizations to tell their stories?
No, thank you. We look at it in two ways. The first is, you know, organizations that are getting it right. As Mindy mentioned, I think, you know, local and diverse media, they seem to have a better handle on coverage representation. Of course, they can be more participatory journalism, but there we think we see better coverage. So the challenge there, they're all struggling economically. So our focus there is on what we think, what can we do to help save local media with regards to the challenges they're facing with siphoning off their advertising, which was their primary revenue source. How can we change public attitudes so that, you know, subscription is a good thing, you should be paying for news, that you should actually donate to newspapers? What can we do in Washington? You know, I've been very frustrated that throughout the COVID relief efforts, so little attention and relief has gone towards local and diverse media when they're so incredibly needed right now, and they're doing an amazing job of keeping communities informed. So around this, state and local is a lot to do with sort of changing business models and sustainability. With mainstream media, I think the area there is representation and coverage, right? And I think, you know, there are economic incentives, clickbait, that makes the more balanced, more participatory coverage harder. I mean, it's hard for the New York Times to go into small communities and develop really robust stories. And so that's a challenge. And also, you know, I'd love to get Katharine some of the folks, but I don't know why it's so hard to get great Black and brown journalists. I see them all the time. They come to my dinner and they're a room full and they're amazing. So I think putting pressure and, you know, making these mainstream media companies really answer why they're not developing pipelines. And instead of attacking them, we want to work with them. We're going to help you build pipelines. We're going to help you identify. But that's how we look at it. So it's, you know, resources to local and diverse media, efforts towards changing statements into real action with regards to recruiting and storytelling.
Yeah. Jamal, I would also say it's a question of accountability. We see what's happening now with regard to diversity and inclusion with regard to corporate America, and the media is part of that conversation. And we see how sponsors and other supporters have held up continued support unless they saw the change reflected in diversity in media. I do believe that with mainstream media and some of the other parts of media, there's a need for greater accountability by the very entities that they depend on it also, I think, is an obligation for those who come on to the shows. I think about what the director of the National Institutes of Health did last year, which said, I'm not going to participate in any panel ever again, as well as those of my agency, unless they're diverse and inclusive, and not just the panel, but also the audience. So I think there are very demonstrable steps that, in addition to what David has said, that can be done within the private sector to hold media more accountable for the very lack of diversity which exists, that is having clear impacts in the way that the stories are being told. But even more dangerous is the level of contribution to the divide that exists on stories that take place today. I think about the stories around Colin Kaepernick. We talked a few moments ago about the impact of people's careers being harmed by what they say, what they don't say. I think about what happened to Colin Kaepernick and how much the media and those writing and covering it focused on the knee rather than focused on what led him to take the knee. And so those are nuances that have incredible impact. And I think it's just as Toni Morrison taught us, definitions belong to the definers, not the definition. If there are more people that look like us or reflective of the communities that media covers who are defining the stories, shaping the stories, I think you're going to have a lot more authentic and in transparency in how those stories will say. I will say this lastly, if I want to find out how the media is covering stories across the community, I look in the metro sections of the paper, because that's where you can see very well how the stories are being covered at the community level, and whether or not they're reflective of the community that you understand. You mentioned Detroit. Mindy mentioned some elements before, and I have read my own hometown paper, the Boston Globe, and I've said I can't be that the metro section is covering that community, because that's not what the people in that community are reflective of. So I think there's a lot that can be done both on the public and the private side, but holding media companies accountable is number one on my list.
All right, Katherine, we got about 45 seconds here, Katherine, but I want to end with you because you do inclusion for a living.
Okay, well, yeah, we're in diversity recruiting. So it costs money, right? You have to go out and you have to have people who are very focused, going into communities, inviting people to apply who feel like they've been shunned for generations. And that takes resources on the ground. So it does start with supporting news organizations, but also news organizations pivoting money into recruiting more and not relying on referral networks.
Right.
And it's just very important. If organizations spent less on marketing about how they care about Black Lives Matter and more on actually going out and finding more Black people for their positions, we would be in a different situation today.
All right. Thank you all for being here. This is a really great panel. I want to thank the audience for joining in here a little bit. And David, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you've got an unsung hero to talk to us about.
Jamal, thank you. Thank you for this great conversation. So one of my favorite features of the platform is our ability to truly acknowledge multicultural media excellence that typically go unrecognized. So I'm really excited to introduce our unsung hero, Ms. Elinor Ruth Tatum, who's the publisher and editor of the York Amsterdam News, one of the oldest Black newspapers in the country, founded in 1909. Elinor, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, David. It's so wonderful to be here, and thank you, MMCA, for giving me this wonderful award. I'm really honored.
So let's jump in. So you've been hearing about our discussion. Tell us a little bit about how the New York Amsterdam News is trying to make sure your readers is getting balanced coverage as you report on the protests and COVID and all the issues that are going down. What is your strategy and how you achieve it?
Well, one of the things that is really important is that when we're covering any of the things that are going on right now, or at any time for that matter, that we're talking to experts within our communities. I think it was Lacey was just saying that, so many times you see these panels and there's nobody of color on those panels. there's nobody representing communities of color on those panels. So especially when it's come to COVID, we're talking to doctors of color. We're talking to health experts of color. When it comes to talking about education in COVID, we're talking to educators of color, educators that are dealing with communities of color. And so we're making sure that we're talking to the people that are talking to our communities, the people that really know deep down what is happening to our communities, so we can report and give information to our communities that is actually germane to our communities. Because, talking to somebody that knows nothing about our community does not have information, though they may be an expert on something, doesn't mean they're an expert on what it's going to mean to our community. So that is something that's so important when it comes to reporting.
No, that's it. I'm sorry.
Yes.
No, it's okay. Please, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry.
But so that is one of the things that being a Black newspaper is different than mainstream reporting is, because the mainstream article can tell a story, but it's not necessarily telling you what you're going to need to know if you're a community of color.
No, it's awesome. I just think, I'm a big sort of supporter of the Washington Informer and Delisa's paper here. I think she does a tremendous job. Switching gears a little bit, but one of the things that she speaks a lot about, and Representative Clarke, who is going to join us, has been working very hard to try to get COVID relief to local and diverse media. Talk a little bit about what you're experiencing and what it's been like, the pressures on your paper and because of the COVID crisis. I already knew that, things were not great before this, but I know things have gotten even worse.
Well, as soon as COVID hit, the first thing that happened is advertising dried up immediately. We lost about 90% of our advertising overnight. And then our distribution networks completely dried up because most of the newsstands were closed. I would say almost 75% of those were closed. So our distribution network dried up as well as our advertising network. So therefore, that switch had to happen immediately, and we had to learn how to also work remotely. So production had to go remote. So there was a huge learning curve. And that happened, and we all were nimble, and we figured out how to do it. And our websites became more robust overnight, and we got the news out, and we continued to produce, and we are still alive, and we are still getting the news out to our communities. And because of something like that, we have created new avenues and new projects, and we are doing great things and producing great stories.
Now, that's awesome. So one of the things you recently spearheaded, launched a fund for Black journalism. Tell us a little bit about that and how can we help?
Well, yes, we have just started the Fund for Black Journalism, which is an endeavor that came out of COVID and the unrest that was going on across America that started after the death of George Floyd. And right now we have 10 newspapers that have come together with the help of the LMA. And we're basically trying to reimagine the Black press in America. And the goal of the fund is to help boost up the journalism and to make sure that we're able to report on those stories that are really affecting our communities in a both local and a national way. So for instance, our first big story that we're going to be working on is going to be education during COVID for communities of color. Wow. And so we've got 10 newspapers to start off with. It's the Amsterdam News, the Houston Defender, Atlanta Voice, Washington Informer, Dallas Weekly, the Afro, the Michigan Chronicle, Seattle Medium, the Sacramento Observer, the St. Louis American, and we're all going to be reporting on the same stories, but how it's going to be affecting our communities in particular, and then working on a national story that a national reporter is going to be doing, and then disseminating it across the country. So we're really going to be working hard, but we've got to raise a lot of money to do that. And we've got some really lofty goals because we really want to do some big things with this. And we have a 3-year goal of $25 million. Because we want to expand this to many, many more newspapers, over 50. So if you want to help us get to this goal and help us to really expand this journalism that we're trying to do and really get this word out and be able to hire more Black journalists across this country and really get to train more. So we've got that pipeline as well. You can Google Fund for Black Journalism and it'll get you right to the link to be able to donate. And so far we started to raise a lot of money. We've got over 260 donations already, and we're well on our way. But every dollar helps.
Well, Elinor, thank you for all you do, and you can count on our support. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David.
All right, so let's bring back in. All right, so just for some closing thoughts, I am really grateful for this panel, for giving us some really concrete solutions, but we know this is just the beginning, right? This is the hard work of building support and actually getting these things implemented. We have no illusions about how difficult the road is ahead, but we're undeterred. And we need your help, and we need you to support what we're doing, support the efforts like the one you just heard about, and really help us move the needle in a robust way. Lisi, any closing thoughts?
Thank you. Well, I'll end where we started, which was with the Kerner Commission. I think we have the hindsight that gives us the insight, that gives us the foresight, that gives us the clear sight on what needs to be done. We still have a problem of diversity within media. We know a lot of the challenges stem from the lack of investment. We also know that there's a need to bring in public and private support to help change that. And we know what the impact has been, will continue to be, until we have more and better inclusive and diverse media rooms on the stories and the narratives that get told. And so that has real implication. And I think that the conversation that we've had today is reflective of both what the challenges are, but what the opportunities are. So I'm hoping that those who are listening and those who will come to watch this will get involved. And as John Lewis said, ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America. We have the opportunity to redeem and take back, if you will, and have a more diverse and inclusive media in this country. Thank you.
And thank you to all our amazing panelists and our outstanding moderator, Jamal. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.